The belief you've encountered centers on a debate regarding the translation of specific Greek words in the New Testament, particularly those found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9 and 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10, and the cultural shift that occurred with the publication of the 1946 Revised Standard Version (RSV) of the Bible. The core of the debate. The discussion focuses on two key Greek words that appear in the New Testament vice lists. 1. Malakoi, malaki. This word literally means soft or effeminate. Historically, in many pre-1946 translations, it was often rendered as effeminate, soft, or wanton. Scholars debate whether it referred to passive participants in male-male sexual acts, especially in the context of prostitution or non-procreative acts, effeminate men, or those generally considered to be lacking in self-control or moral fiber. 2. Arsenokoitai, brisenokozde. This is a compound word meaning man-betters, or men who lie with a male. Before 1946, it was often translated with phrases like abusers of themselves with mankind, sodomites, or liars with men. The 1946 translation shift. The significant event was the 1946 Revised Standard Version, RSV, of the New Testament, which was the first English translation to use the term homosexuals to translate the combined meaning of malakoi and arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9. The claim of misinterpretation. Proponents of the view you mentioned argue that in the context of the ancient world, arsenokoitai and similar terms were primarily used to condemn abusive, exploitative, and predatory sexual behaviors, which could include pederasty, sexual relations between an adult male and an adolescent boy, sexual slavery, or prostitution, rather than consensual same-sex relationships between adults as understood by the modern term homosexuality, which was coined much later in the late 19th century. This perspective suggests the prohibitions were against sexual exploitation and power dynamics, like the abuse of a boy or a slave, and that the RSV Committee's decision to use homosexuals in 1946 was influenced by the cultural biases of the time, thereby creating a new, explicit, blanket scriptural condemnation of all forms of same-sex orientation and behavior that had not been textually explicit before. The counter-argument. The mainstream traditional view in Christian theology is that the biblical texts, including the Old Testament Levitical passages and the New Testament verses in question, have always been understood as a clear condemnation of male-male sexual intercourse, regardless of the age or power dynamics, as a fundamental deviation from God's design for sexual relations. This view contends that the 1946 RSV simply used a new, modern English term, homosexuals, to capture a concept that was already present and condemned by the ancient Greek and Hebrew texts, even if the specific ancient concepts also included exploitation like pederasty. They argue that earlier translations, like the King James Version's quote, abusers of themselves with mankind, were already widely interpreted to include same-sex acts. Summary of the interpretive difference. Feature: the pre-1946 interpretation was about pedophilia argument. The traditional/mainstream interpretation, focus of original text, primary concern was with abusive, exploitative sex acts, like pederasty, prostitution, and slavery, often involving an age or power imbalance, a clear, unqualified prohibition of all male sexual intercourse as contrary to God's law. Impact of 1946 RSV. The insertion of homosexuals was a mistranslation that created an explicit, blanket condemnation of modern, consensual same-sex identity/behavior. The use of homosexuals was a modernization of a condemnation that was already understood from the original text use of phrases like sodomites or abusers of themselves with mankind. In essence, the controversy isn't that the Bible began condemning all same-sex activity only in 1946, but rather that the specific word choice in the 1946 RSV dramatically shifted the English language interpretation from a broad set of forbidden acts, which may have centered on exploitative practices like pederasty, to an explicit modern condemnation of the identity or behavior now known as homosexuality. This debate remains a critical point of divergence between affirming and non-affirming Christian traditions. Conversation summary. Topic: the historical interpretation of religious texts, specifically the shift in translating biblical verses on same-sex activity around 1946. Key information provided. Explanation of the controversy surrounding the Greek words malakoi and arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9 and 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10. The 1946 Revised Standard Version RSV was the first to use the term homosexuals. The two main arguments are: 1. The original text was focused on exploitation and pederasty, and 1946 was a mistranslation. 2. The original text was always understood as condemning same-sex acts, and 1946 was a modern restatement.